Hey folks, welcome back to our Sky Tonight program. My name is Seth Mayo. I am the curator of astronomy for the Loma Planetarium at MOAS, and in this edition of the program, we are covering the dates of April 4th through April 10th. We're going to start things off by talking again about Saturn and Mars that are really close in our morning sky. Then we're going to look to the east and take a look at the wonderful spring constellation of Virgo, mention its mythology and some interesting objects inside of it. We'll move just north of it to the constellation of Boötes and how that kind of connects with Virgo and the Big Dipper. So let's get to it. If you haven't had a chance to look in the morning sky towards the east lately, you definitely got to get out there and look because you have all of these wonderful planets in that area. We've talked a lot about this because this is where all of the visible eye planets are located right now, and they are very close to each other, especially two that are still really close that we mentioned last week's episode. So you notice in this area we're looking towards the east and southeast just before the sun rises, so we're really in kind of the 6 o'clock hour, 6 a.m. And one thing that we mentioned is that Jupiter is rising down here, getting a little higher and higher this month. We have Venus really shining. That is the brightest planet you can see in the sky, so it's hard to miss that one. But then to the right of Venus or to the south of it, you'll see these two planets really close to each other. So we'll zoom into that area here. And on Monday morning, these were actually just a little bit closer, but even on Tuesday morning, April 5th, they are still really close, and even some days afterwards as well, which is quite nice. What we have here are two planets of different colors. You'll find the planet here just above, the planet Saturn, which will have kind of a white or milky appearance to it, and that is really amazing. And then just below that, really close, is the reddish planet Mars that we see there. So these are so close at this point that even through a telescope, you should be able to see them in one field of view, these two planets together. And if you do, you have a chance to see something really cool. Maybe the rings of Saturn and maybe some of its moons, and again, the planetary surface of Mars. Now, Mars is fairly far away from us right now, so it's not as big as it can get, and so you'll just see it's really little dots still, but it's still neat to see that reddish color along with the planet Saturn there. So this very nice conjunction is great, especially because the color difference between them will be quite apparent, and you can fit them in your field of view either through binoculars or a telescope. Maybe have a chance to take a picture of this. That is what I'm going to try to do around this time, is take a picture of these two planets so close, and we'll see how that turns out. I'm excited to take a look. So hopefully you'll continue to pay attention to this part of the sky. These planets have been shuffling around, and there's going to be more conjunctions going on between other planets in this area this month. So it'll be fun to watch the planetary dance going on in this part of the sky. Now that we're in the month of April, this is of course a time of spring, and there's one particular constellation that really reminds you of this time of year for the spring season, and that is the constellation called Virgo. And Virgo is just rising in the east just after sunset, and this is the time of year that you can see Virgo all night long from sunset all the way to sunrise. So it moves across the entire sky at this time of the year. So if we look down here low in the east in this part of the sky, a little bit after sunset, right when it's dark, we can find the stars of Virgo. And it's not one of the brighter constellations, but what is interesting is it is one of the largest by area in the sky. It's the second largest constellation of all of the night sky. And we're going to turn it on here. Now, every time I look for Virgo, I look for Leo the lion first, because Leo is a lot easier to spot up here. There is Leo. You can see his head, body, and tail, which is a little triangle. Below it are the stars of Virgo. And Virgo also, to me, looks like the Big Dipper. It is not the Big Dipper, but it has the appearance of a dipper-like shape. So let's turn on the outline of Virgo. You can see the stars of it, and again, very large. Now, it might be hard to tell that it's so large here, but if I turn on the constellation boundary, what you can find is it does cover a pretty big area of the sky. Just for reference, the largest constellation, and that is of Hydra, that's kind of slithering nearby, that we talked about quite recently. You can find it right here, the Lernian Hydra, and I'll turn that on as well just so you can see how large it is. It really covers a big area of the sky. Now focusing back on Virgo again, as you can see, it does cover a pretty big area of the sky here. Now Virgo from Greek mythology was the maiden. I'll turn on her picture. She's a woman, And of course, Virgo is quite famous because, as you probably know, it's one of the signs of the zodiac. It lies along the ecliptic, the path that the sun seems to make in the sky as we go around the sun. So it is the largest zodiacal constellation. And since it lies on the ecliptic, the plane of our solar system, that means the moon and the planets at some point will pass through this constellation since they move along this line. Another important place along the ecliptic actually belongs in Virgo. Actually, if we turn on the celestial equator, you'll notice they cross near the head of Virgo, right in here. And that is actually during the time of our autumnal equinox that for us in the northern hemisphere occurs in September. And that's when you can't see Virgo because the sun is crossing that position in the sky. It means that the sun is in this area. So that's when you cannot see the constellation anymore. But it's an important point marking where the equinox occurs at that time of the year. Now, going back to Greek mythology, there are many stories that involve Virgo, but the one that I think is most interesting and that ties to spring is the story that Virgo personifies a woman named Persephone. And if you know Persephone, she was actually the daughter of the Greek goddess Demeter, who is the goddess of harvest and agriculture and farming. So she was part of a very important family. And Persephone embodied the springtime. So as she lived on the earth, it was spring all the time. It was perpetual spring. But as the story goes, Hades, the god of the underworld, also the brother of Zeus, he falls in love with Persephone as he watches her and actually kidnaps her and brings her to the underworld and forces her to marry him. And as that happened, she left the earth, which meant the spring was no longer here, and all of a sudden the earth was plunged into a perpetual wintertime, which of course no one wanted. The gods did not want this, and Demeter was completely heartbroken, especially for her daughter, but also because Demeter is the goddess of agriculture and farming, and it's tough to do her job if there is a perpetual wintertime. So Zeus intervened because of all this and forced Hades to at least allow Persephone to leave the underworld for part of the year and come up to Earth to spend time with her mother, bringing about the spring and early summer for only part of the year. So I always thought that was an interesting explanation for the seasons, that when she went down to the underworld, you'd have the winter time and a very cold time of the year in the northern hemisphere. And then when she'd reemerge in March and April, things would warm back up, the plants would be growing again, flowers are blooming as she remained on Earth, and the seasons would continue to change as she went again back to her husband Hades in the underworld in the fall, and the seasons would change back in the wintertime once again. So I like that kind of connection with the constellations, especially because Virgo is rising in the evening right here in the springtime and can be seen all night long. So it's kind of a good reminder of that. And there's actually a very bright star in Virgo that kind of connects with this agriculture theme. And you'll notice here at the bottom right, you'll notice she's holding a ear of wheat here, and that's where this star Spica lives, right there. It's a pretty famous binary star system, and in the top 20 brightest stars in our sky, it's about 250 light years away. And in Latin, Spica means ear of wheat or ear of grain. So you can see that's where she's holding that in the constellation itself, at least in the picture provided by Stellarium, which is quite helpful. And one other thing I'll mention about Virgo that I think is really interesting is that near her torso, kind of in the upper area of the constellation, is a trove of galaxies. And I'll point you to one galaxy in particular in this area. So let's focus on something called M87. And it sort of lies in this area here. M87 is part of a group of galaxies called the Virgo Cluster. Kind of makes sense because it sits inside Virgo, the constellation. There's M87 here. It's in a giant elliptical galaxy, much larger than ours. And you have some other galaxies here. So this is a pretty large cluster at the center of what's called the Virgo supercluster of galaxies. We got thousands and thousands of galaxies in one part of our universe, and our own Milky Way galaxy is part of this Virgo supercluster. This part of the cluster lies at the very heart of it all, which is an amazing area. So this is a great picture, even in Stellarium, showing various galaxies, and then again M87 right here. And we've talked about this before because in the center of this galaxy is a supermassive black hole, 6 billion times more massive than our sun, and it was the first black hole imaged in history, and that came out in 2017. This was from what's called the Event Horizon Telescope. These are a series of radio telescopes around the world that were pulled together to image around the black hole, actually what's called the Event Horizon, where this gas around the black hole is rubbing together and heating up, and some of it is falling in as well. That gave us pictures like this. That's really amazing. This is actually showing us the shadow of the black hole, because you actually cannot see a black hole. They are invisible. So that's an amazing area of space, especially in terms of galaxies and black holes, situated here kind of at the top of Virgo, the Maiden, that great constellation that reminds us that spring is here. Now, what kind of ties to Virgo in the sky nearby is a constellation known as Boötes or Boötes, the Herdsman. And Boötes, in some versions of Greek mythology, was also the son of Demeter, so that would have made them at least siblings in some way in certain versions of those stories. So Boötes lies right here, a little bit north of Virgo, but also kind of rises at the same time. So we'll turn on that constellation there, and he's sort of sideways to Virgo in the sky. And just like Virgo, if you see Boötes rising, you know that spring is here, especially when it's rising in the east, and you can pretty much see it all night long at this time of the year as well. This constellation is known as the Herdsman, or the Plow driver, or sometimes the Ox driver. And so sometimes you see pictures of him with various animals or farming tools, so he kind of also ties into the agricultural theme, like Virgo the Maiden. In some stories, he's connected to another constellation above him called Canis Venatici, which are two dogs. So in certain celestial maps, you'll see him holding a leash or ropes to these two dogs in the sky at times. And since he was known as the Ox driver or the Plow driver, there were even some stories saying that he invented the plow. And it was thought that what we now call the Big Dipper in the sky right here was actually known as the Plow in ancient Greek stories, and that this was his plow that he pushed through the celestial field in the sky, which I think is kind of neat to think about. So all of that, again, ties to this agricultural theme. But the really bright star inside of Boötes is associated with another famous story. And the star that we're talking about is this one right here, known as Arcturus. It is actually the fourth brightest star in the sky. You've probably seen it before, rising in the east at this time of the year, or at least sometime when it's in the sky, it really shines. You'll notice it's a little bit of an orange-red color because it's a red supergiant star at the end of its life, and it's a good example of what our sun will do when it starts dying as it bloats up into a red giant. That name, Arcturus, means guardian of the bear. It has the name Arc in it, or Arctos, and Arctos means bear. And that's where the word Arctic comes from, since bears kind of inhabit areas near the Arctic in the northern hemisphere. So that's kind of interesting where that term comes from. So Arcturus, that name is commonly associated with the character known as Arcus, who was the son of the nymph named Callisto. Callisto had an affair with Zeus. Zeus fell in love with her since she was a nymph. She was very beautiful. And they had a love child known as Arcus. And to make a long story short, because there's so many variations of this story and it can get quite long and complicated, Hera, the wife of Zeus, was very jealous of this affair, and she found out about it, turned Callisto, Arcus's mother, into a bear, and she inhabited one part of Greece for quite some time. At some point, Arcus, who was a very famous hunter, was traveling in the woods, came across this bear, did not know it was his mother, and she came towards him because she loved her son and wanted to see him. He thought he was being threatened by the bear. Zeus happened to see all of this occur and did not want Arcus to shoot this bear, shoot his mother and kill her. So he turned Arcus into a bear himself, and they lived together. And Hera still didn't like this and wanted them killed. So to protect them, Zeus took them by the tails, threw them into the sky, and placed them into the stars, creating the constellations actually nearby, because the Big Dipper is actually part of the rear end of a bear called Ursa Major, which would have been Callisto, the mother. And the Little Dipper down here, where you find the North Star there, is part of a little bear known as Ursa Minor, which represents Arcus, all tying to the bright star in Boötes, the herdsman here, Arcturus. So it's kind of fun to kind of connect all of that together, kind of relating to Arctic and bears in this part of the sky. This is a very northern section of the sky. And what's kind of neat is what connects all of these characters, even Virgo together, is actually the tail of Ursa Major or the handle of the Big Dipper. And it's a little mnemonic that astronomers and stargazers like to use to locate these bright stars we've already mentioned, is that you can arc from the handle of the Big Dipper, you arc to Arcturus in Boötes here, and then you spike to Spica inside of Virgo. I've mentioned it before on occasion, but I always like to remind folks of this because it kind of helps you connect all these interesting areas of the sky, and they're all kind of tied together in some way from Greek mythology. So I love that about certain areas of the sky. So anyway, you arc from the handle of the Big Dipper, arc to Arcturus, spike to Spica, really showing you some of the great spring objects, constellations, and stars that are clearly seen rising the east and that are visible all night long at this time of the year. Well, thanks again for tuning in to another edition of our Sky Tonight program. We hope to see you back here again soon. And I want to advertise a major space event here at the museum and the Lohmann Planetarium, and that is our upcoming annual MOAS Space Day on Saturday, April 9th from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. If you're at our museum, we're celebrating all things space at that time, where we have some exhibitors and organizations from nearby Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. We also have volunteers from Volusia County school systems and students from other nearby colleges that are going to be helping with hands-on space activities and rocket launches. And we have our GE volunteers that will be launching paper rockets in our auditorium, which is a lot of fun. And of course, in our Lohmann Planetarium, we got a nice lineup of shows. We have a special speaker coming as well. And it's just a fun day to celebrate all things space, all things astronomy at the Museum of Arts and Sciences. Again, on Saturday, April 9th from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. So we hope to see you here for that event. But of course, we hope to see you at any time of the year at the museum and of course the Lohmann Planetarium, when we're always running shows daily on the hour. And if you want any more information about Space Day or our regular daily show lineup or any other events at the museum, please check our website. So with that, we can't wait to see you back here again for another edition of the program. And of course, happy stargazing.